obviously a lot about international studies. And one of the reasons why I would like to discuss that with you today is we see in our research that international tests influence learning. And we do see it in 3 different ways. We see that somehow, just like you mentioned in the introduction, people are starting discussing both what is valuable learning, what kind of teaching methods shall we use. They're kind of looking across countries to see what people are doing. But also we see now evidence that different national assessment systems are influenced by these big international studies. And also, finally, we are starting to see empirical evidence in how students approach tests, because when our national tests are influenced by the international tests, it also influences the way items and tasks are developed and what we in fact teach in class. And one of the countries which we do see that is, for instance, Norway, the country I'm from. So, just to give you a flavor of changes which have been written about in the literature. In Norway, they introduced national tests in 2004. Before that, they didn't have national tests at all. So they had final exams, but after the PISA shock, which they called it, just like in Germany, where Norwegian results were lower than expected, they changed the whole system and introduced national tests, also in English, since English is a language Norwegians do take. In Denmark, you saw some of the similar pattern. They also introduced national tests there. And even in Japan, which is one of the high-performing countries in these international studies, even there they changed the format of the tasks they were using. They were starting to look at the framework in PISA and what kind of tasks PISA used, and then they changed the format. The same they did in Korea, but in Korea they even had looked at tasks at the university entrance exam, and they changed that because they would like things to be more similar to PISA. And finally, in Germany, also introduction of national education standards and more focused upon external assessment, which they didn't have previously. So as you can see, what goes on internationally in these studies, it does also influence countries. But what is PISA? But as you can see, PISA was launched by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, and it is a study for 15-year-olds. If you go to the website and, for instance, Google OECD, they have quite a lot of information about PISA. In fact, sometimes when I teach the students, I show them the first introductory minutes of that PISA Measuring Student Success Around the World movie, because it's very informative, but you just have to keep in mind it's made of OECD, so obviously it tells you all the good things about PISA. And you can discuss critically after what this is all about. We have a paper which my leader, Professor Joanne Baird at Oxford University Centre for Educational Assessment, is now leading and forthcoming. And several of us have looked at the impact of PISA and the history around PISA in the world. And one of the motivations for starting PISA was that OECD said we actually do need some indicators. We do not know enough about what's going on. And they had something called Education at a Glance, where it described also the historical development around PISA. But then we also know that countries increasingly need to be able to compete in the knowledge economy, OECD argues. And that's an argument who teachers are facing. At the same time, others will say, like researchers like Greg and Jimmy Oscar, for instance, they say that there's a growing recognition of the power that such surveys have to affect educational assessment policy. So in one way you can see that countries suddenly are facing all this data, all these results coming, and then they feel that they need to respond to it. But there are people who have questioned whether the questions asked in PISA is actually the questions you would like to be asked. So there are some dynamics here between what's going on between the OECD and also between the countries participating. But how is PISA now? When it started in 2000, and we have this study every 3 years, it was 32 OECD countries participating. In 2015, it was 71 countries participating. And these days, they are also developing what they call PISA for development world. So there will also be new countries which have not participated before, which will be offered to participate in 2018. So if you look at a map of the world, you will see that more and more countries do participate, and this is why it influences what's going on in education. What does it measure then? Well, it measures reading, mathematics, science, literacy, and also problem solving, and for the first time in 2018, something which they will call global competencies. And this morning I was thinking that will be a challenging competence to measure, but perhaps we need to talk about what does it mean to be a person which has global competences. What does it mean? What I find particularly interesting in PISA, and more interesting sometimes than only the tasks in reading, mathematics and science, is the student background questionnaire, which will give us information about how 15-year-olds are motivated for school and subjects. They report what kind of reading strategies they believe they are using. They also tell about their parents' education, occupation, and language spoken at home. And of course, that variable is particularly interesting for this conference, because we do have some information coming out of these studies which could be helpful. It is paper-based, so when students took this test, they sit down and take a test, and some of it is also computer-based, and then they have this background questionnaire. They also have a pattern where you can see that one of the domains is like the major domains. So that means that they have most test items in that domain. So for instance, in 2015, when the PISA results will be published in December next year, then science will be like the main focus of the study. And in 2018, again, it will be reading. To give you a flavor, I don't know how many of you have seen a PISA task, but I've chosen one which has been released, which I particularly like. Okay. Semmelweis Diary, July 1846. Next week I will take up a position as a doctor at the first ward of the maternity clinic of the Vienna General Hospital. I was frightened when I heard about the percentage of patients who die in this clinic. This month, not less than 36 out of the 208 mothers died there, all from puerperal fever. Giving birth to a child is as dangerous as first-degree pneumonia. These lines from the diary of Ignaz Semmelweis illustrate the devastating effects of fever, a contagious disease that killed many women after childbirth. Semmelweis collected data around the number of deaths from the fever in both the first and second wards. See diagram. So here, this is a science task for 15-year-olds. And if you look at this, it's quite a lot of text, and then it's a combination with a graph. And if you look at the next page, and I will not read this for you, but again you see that there's quite a lot of text information here. And then comes the PISA task question, which says, suppose you were Semmelweis, give a reason based on the data Semmelweis collected why this fever is unlikely to be caused by earthquakes. And that is a very typical PISA task, because it's an open response and the students have to use a combination of text, graphs, and interpret and give evidence. And it's a science task. And if you're thinking about the students you are teaching, my guess is that they need quite a good vocabulary in English to be able to sit and do these tests in science when they are that heavy loaded with text. And so that is one of my messages for you today, is actually to see how PISA tasks are framed and how much text is in them, just so you know that this is the kind of expectations for our students when they are going to show how good they are in science. And it's the same in mathematics. I don't have any mathematics task with me, but I have been interviewing students after they took the PISA test, and some of them have actually said, it was hard for me to know which of the tasks were science tasks, which one was reading, and which one was mathematics literacy. because very many of the reading tasks uses, for instance, themes from science, but they are testing reading comprehension. And many of the science tasks uses graphs like this, so sometimes they're wondering if it's a little bit about mathematics. What they all have is a lot of text. So students do need to be really good at reading comprehension. This is not something which the papers are interested in. Usually when the media picks up on PISA, this is what they are showing us. So in December 2013, when the results of PISA 2012 came out, this is what the message read. And as a Norwegian, I always find this very strange, because in Scandinavia we were always impressed by the results in England and Scotland and Northern Ireland and in UK, because you were doing so well. But according to the media, this is not good. And also you can see that the politicians are using the results, and also it influences the reforms which happens in different countries. And then finally, you can read this. What's becoming increasingly clear is that our children's education has been suffering in relation to their peers over the last decade. The PISA rankings, for example, which I'm sure have already been debated today, show us falling from 4th to 16th in science, from 7th to 25th in literacy, and from 8th to 28th in maths. And I must say immediately that one of the things with PISA is that this kind of rankings, and whether you are 14th or 15th, it's so small differences sometimes that if you're really interested to look and compare across countries, it's usually like the top 10 countries or in the middle. The 10 middle countries usually have so few differences, the difference between them, that it's really not something to discuss. And also, therefore, I wanted to tell you a tiny little bit what the press does not tell you. For instance, in England, in 2012, only 4% of head teachers reported that truancy was a serious problem to learning in England, compared to 32% of head teachers across OECD. That's really good. That's good news, isn't it? Teacher morale is reported to be very high across the OECD, with head teachers in England reporting it to be even higher than average. Pupils in England are generally very positive about their relationships with their teachers, and more positive than the OECD average. So that is also what about almost 4,000 students in England reported about their relationship to their teachers. And I think those results, when we know how much it influences their learning, I think that is actually something which people should be aware of. Other things, 12%, either first or second generation immigrants, scored 34 points lower in mathematics than non-immigrant students, which is not a surprise. But in the United Kingdom, 13% of students had immigrant background, but scored only 9 points lower on average than non-immigrant students. After taking socioeconomic status into account, the difference is even smaller. So as you can see, again, here's the results are better in the United Kingdom than in OECD. So even if we know that language also influenced the results, we see that the differences are not that big here as in other countries.